The black maid took care of the Mafia boss's father every day, until he discovered the real reason. The story begins on a rainy afternoon in the grandiose mansion of the notorious Mafia boss, Dominic Romano. The sprawling estate, nestled on a quiet hill just outside of New York City, was the picture of luxury. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and priceless artwork adorned every room. But amidst the opulence, one room was different. It was the bedroom of Dominic's father, the aging patriarch of the Romano family, who had once ruled with an iron fist, but now lay frail and nearly immobile in his bed. The once mighty Don was now a shadow of his former self, a man withering away in silence, his health failing him day by day. For the last few months, there had been one person who had been by his side every single day. Her name was Clara, a black maid who had worked in the Romano mansion for over a year. She wasn't a part of the family, nor did she carry any special connection to them. She was simply a worker, someone who cleaned the floors and served meals. But Clara did something that no one else had done. She cared for Dominic's father in a way that no one else could. She would wake up at dawn, quietly slipping into the old man's room to help him with his daily needs. She fed him, bathed him, and stayed by his side for hours. Despite his gruff demeanor and the coldness that seemed to permeate the Romano family, Clara never once complained. She treated him with the same respect and care that she would her own family. It was a simple act of kindness, but to the old man, it was something he hadn't felt in a long time, genuine compassion. Over time, he began to look forward to her presence. Clara's soft voice would soothe him during his restless nights, and the way she listened to him, truly listened, brought him comfort. No one in the mansion had ever paid him this much attention. No one had cared, but Clara did. However, it wasn't just her dedication that made her stand out. It was the secret she kept hidden. A secret that, when revealed, would change everything. In the weeks that followed, Dominic Romano, the Mafia boss, started to notice something odd. Every time he visited his father's room, he saw Clara, the maid, tending to his father's needs with an unwavering commitment. At first, he had dismissed it as just another act of routine care. But there was something different about her. She wasn't just fulfilling her duties. There was an undeniable bond between them, something his father hadn't experienced in years. His father, once the leader of a ruthless criminal empire, had always been feared and respected by many. But now, in his old age, he had been reduced to a frail, lonely man. His health was declining rapidly, and yet, Clara seemed to be the only person who truly cared for him. Dominic had heard rumors about Clara's kindness, but he hadn't thought much of it. To him, the maids were just part of the mansion's background, invisible to everyone unless they were needed. But the more he watched, the more he realized there was something deeper to Clara's actions. She had been there day after day, offering comfort and companionship to a man who was used to being surrounded by fear and authority. Dominic knew that his father had never been one to show vulnerability. His father's harsh exterior had been a shield, even in his old age. But Clara had pierced through that shield with her quiet compassion. It was a stark contrast to the cold, calculated world Dominic had built around him. One evening, Dominic couldn't take it anymore. He had been watching Clara from a distance for weeks, but he wanted to know the truth. What was it about her that made her so different? Why was she so dedicated to his father, when others would simply do their job and leave? He decided to confront her. As he walked into his father's room that night, the dim light from the chandelier cast long shadows on the walls. His father was sleeping peacefully, his shallow breathing the only sound in the room. Clara was sitting by the window, her back to him, watching the rain fall outside. She didn't hear him enter. For a moment, Dominic simply stood there, observing her. She wasn't the typical maid he was used to. She wasn't afraid of him. Her presence was calm, serene, almost like she belonged in this house more than he did. It made him uneasy. He cleared his throat, and Clara turned, her expression unchanged. "You've been taking care of him for a long time now," Dominic said, his voice low, almost questioning. Clara met his gaze, but said nothing. She had always been careful not to engage with Dominic beyond what was necessary. But something in his tone, something in the way he looked at her, made her pause. She could feel the weight of his gaze, but she remained composed. "He's been through a lot," she replied softly, "and he deserves more than just being a burden." Dominic felt a knot form in his stomach. He had never seen this side of Clara. She spoke with such care, such honesty. It was as if she truly understood his father in a way he never could. "And you?" Dominic asked, his voice colder now. "What do you get out of all this?" Clara paused, considering her words carefully. "I get peace," she said, her voice steady. "I get the chance to do something that matters." Dominic felt a strange pang of guilt. It was something he rarely felt, especially in his line of work. His world was built on power, on control, and yet here was Clara, a simple maid, talking about peace. It felt alien to him. "You're not afraid of me?" Dominic asked, his voice a bit softer this time. Clara shook her head slowly. "Fear is a waste of energy, Mr. Romano. It doesn't help anyone." Dominic didn't know what to say. For the first time, he found himself speechless in her presence. It was unsettling. He had always been the one in control, the one others feared and respected. But Clara? She was different. She wasn't intimidated by him, and for some reason, that made him uneasy. As he left the room that night, Dominic couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Clara than met the eye. Something that tied her to his father in a way he hadn't expected. And it wasn't just her kindness. There was a mystery surrounding her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The next day, Dominic decided to look deeper. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find, but he knew he had to understand why this maid had become so important to his father. The answer, when he finally discovered it, would change everything. Dominic had never felt so conflicted in his life. The more he observed Clara's actions, the more his mind raced, unable to understand why a simple maid would choose to dedicate herself so fully to a man like his father. He had watched her care for him, tending to his every need with patience and tenderness that seemed to break through the cold walls his father had built over the years. Still, something gnawed at him. What was her real motivation? Why had she, someone with no ties to the Romano family, become so attached to his father? The following week, Dominic took matters into his own hands. He decided to uncover Clara's past. He couldn't let himself believe that this was just a story of pure altruism. People didn't act like this for nothing. As the Mafia boss, he had access to everything and everyone. With a few words, he ordered his men to look into Clara's history, digging into her past. His men came back with a file, but it was thinner than he had expected. There were no signs of any criminal activity, no dark secrets. But the file had one glaring detail. Clara had lost a daughter just a year ago. The information hit Dominic like a cold wave. Her daughter had been young, only 3 years old, and had died suddenly. The cause was unclear, but the tragedy had left Clara heartbroken. For the first time, Dominic felt a strange sympathy for her. The maid, a woman he had once seen as a mere servant, now had a story that felt heartbreakingly real. The loss of a child was something he couldn't even begin to comprehend, though he imagined it must have been something like the pain he had felt when his own mother had passed years ago. That night, Dominic made his way back to his father's room. His mind was racing, torn between the need for answers and the unexpected empathy he felt for Clara. He stood by the door, looking through the crack, watching her again. She was sitting beside his father, holding his hand gently, her head resting against the back of the chair as she quietly hummed a soft lullaby. Dominic had never seen his father so peaceful. The old man, once feared and revered by everyone around him, now seemed small and fragile. And for the first time in years, he looked content. As Dominic stood there, he realized something that made him freeze in his tracks. It wasn't just that Clara had been taking care of his father. It wasn't just her quiet kindness or the way she humbly performed her duties. It was the way she connected with him. She wasn't just performing a job. She was filling a gap that no one else had been able to. His father had been isolated for so long, even in the presence of his family and his empire. He had spent his life building an empire of fear, control, and ruthless authority, but it had come at a cost. He had lost the simple human connection that Clara was offering him now. Dominic turned and walked out of the room quietly, his thoughts swirling. The guilt he had been feeling over the past few days only deepened. How had he not noticed this before? Why had he allowed his father to live in isolation for so long? And why had he not seen the subtle, yet profound impact Clara had on him? The following morning, Dominic called Clara into his office. His heart was pounding, and a sense of nervousness hung in the air between them. He had never spoken to her outside of casual commands or short exchanges, but today felt different. Today, he needed answers. When Clara entered the room, Her usual calm demeanor was replaced by a subtle tension. She knew something was different. Dominic gestured for her to sit, his eyes never leaving hers. "Clara," he began, his voice low, "I've been watching you with my father. I know you've been taking care of him, but there's more to this, isn't there?" Clara paused for a moment before answering, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I've been doing my job, sir," she replied softly. Dominic shook his head. "This is more than a job. I know there's something else." Clara remained silent, her eyes downcast. He could see the hesitation in her, the wall she had built around herself. He could feel the weight of her pain, and for the first time, he realized he wasn't angry with her. He felt something else, guilt, perhaps, or regret for not understanding sooner. "You lost your daughter, didn't you?" Dominic asked gently, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara's eyes snapped up to meet his, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her gaze. "Yes," she replied, her voice breaking. "Slightly. I lost her, and I couldn't do anything to save her." The words hung in the air, heavy and sorrowful. Dominic could feel the pain radiating from her. He wasn't sure how to respond. He had never been one to deal with emotions, especially not his own. But in that moment, he realized that Clara wasn't just taking care of his father. She was healing herself through her acts of kindness. She had given up so much of herself for others, first her daughter, and now his father. Dominic sat down behind his desk, his heart heavy with a newfound understanding. "You don't have to explain, Clara," he said softly. "But I need you to know something. I see what you've been doing, and I want you to understand that it's not just going unnoticed." Clara looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Dominic stood and walked around the desk, coming to stand beside her. "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. You've done something for my father that no one else could. And for that, I'm grateful." Clara didn't say anything, but her eyes welled up with tears. Dominic could see the weight she had been carrying, the years of pain and loss. And for the first time, he realized that her kindness, her compassion, had changed not just his father's life, but his own as well. After that conversation, Dominic couldn't shake the image of Clara's tear-filled eyes. Her strength, her quiet resilience. It had all been so clear to him now. For so long, he had viewed people like her as just workers, invisible to those in his world. But Clara had shattered that image. She was no longer just a maid in his mind. She was a woman who had suffered, who had given more than anyone should have to, and yet still found the strength to give more. Dominic knew his father was slowly improving, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The once distant, cold man was now showing signs of warmth, of humanity, something that Clara's care had sparked within him. Dominic had to admit, there was a profound change happening that he hadn't expected. The thought of what Clara had done for his father weighed heavily on him, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. His father had always been a figure of fear, of ruthless power. But now he was becoming a man who was beginning to experience the kindness he had never given. Dominic, for the first time, realized that perhaps it wasn't power that had brought him to this point, but loneliness. His father had always been surrounded by people, but there was no one who had truly cared for him, who had treated him as a person, not just the leader of a criminal empire. It had taken Clara, a woman with nothing but the love she could give, to change that. But the more Dominic thought about it, the more he realized that his own life was also lacking something. He had spent years building an empire on fear and control, but it had cost him. He had no one to care for him the way Clara cared for his father. The realization hit him hard. Despite his success, despite the wealth and power he had accumulated, he was just as lonely as his father. The next morning, Dominic found himself standing outside Clara's small quarters in the mansion. He had spent the night turning his thoughts over and over in his head, debating whether he should confront her again. He needed to understand more, not just about her, but about himself as well. He had questions, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to face the answers. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on her door. It was early, and he was sure she hadn't expected a visit from him. When she opened the door, her expression was calm, but her eyes betrayed her surprise. "Mr. Romano," she said, her voice soft. "Is everything all right?" Dominic hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. He had never been good at showing vulnerability, but there was something about Clara that made him feel like he didn't have to hide behind his usual defenses. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice low. About everything you've done for my father. And for me, too, in a way. Clara looked at him, her face unreadable. You've changed him, Clara. Dominic continued, stepping into her small, simple room. I've never seen him this peaceful. I don't know how to explain it. But I also realize that I don't have what you and he have. I don't have anyone who would do for me what you've done for him. Clara's eyes softened, but she didn't say anything. Dominic felt the weight of the silence between them. It was strange, this openness he felt with her. I've been thinking about my own life, Dominic confessed, his voice quieter now. I've built everything on power, on control. But when I look at you, I see something I've been missing. Something I didn't even know I needed. Clara shifted slightly, her gaze still fixed on him. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me, he said, his words coming out in a rush. But I need to know, what is it that makes you keep giving? After everything you've been through, how do you still have this much kindness left? Clara was silent for a long moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been through a lot, Mr. Romano. But I never wanted to be defined by my pain. I wanted to make something good come out of it. Her words hit him harder than he had expected. It was true. Everything he had been chasing in his life had been built on power and fear, but Clara was chasing something entirely different. She wasn't defined by what she had lost, but by what she could still give. She had found a way to heal, to move forward, and in doing so, she had changed the life of a man who had long since given up on anything resembling healing. Dominic felt his chest tighten. I don't know if I can be like you, he said quietly, but I think I want to try. Clara looked at him then, her expression gentle but firm. It's not about being like me, she said. It's about being true to yourself, no matter what has happened to you. Dominic nodded, his mind swirling. He didn't know if he was ready for the changes that he knew were coming, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. As he left her room, he realized that this moment, this conversation, was the beginning of something new for him. The question was no longer whether he could change. The question was whether he was willing to. After their conversation, Dominic found himself reflecting on Clara's words more than he had anticipated. It wasn't just the honesty in her voice, nor the fact that she had shared something so personal about her own suffering. It was the calm, almost serene way in which she had presented herself. Dominic had expected defensiveness, anger, maybe even a cold dismissal, but instead, Clara had revealed a deep well of emotional strength that had left him speechless. It had been a long time since anyone had made him feel so exposed, so vulnerable. For the first time in years, Dominic began to question everything he had known about life and success. The empire he had built, the ruthless, calculated moves he had made to get to the top, all of it seemed so hollow compared to the quiet sacrifice Clara had made for his father. He hadn't realized it at the time, but her actions had sparked a chain of reflection in him. He started looking at his own relationships. How many of them were built on power, fear, and obligation? He had grown up in a world where loyalty was bought, and affection was something to be earned, not freely given. But Clara was different. She had shown loyalty to his father, but it was a loyalty that came from a place of deep compassion, not duty. It wasn't about earning money or recognition. It was about simply caring. That night, Dominic couldn't sleep. His mind was racing with all the thoughts he had pushed aside for so long. He knew he needed to take action. He had to change the way he lived his life. The next morning, he made a decision. He would do something that went against everything he had ever known. He was going to speak to his father, really speak to him, without the walls of power or control that had always separated them. Dominic walked into his father's room that morning, his heart pounding. The old man was sitting up in bed, looking out the window at the gray sky. His frail hands rested on the edge of the blanket, and his eyes were distant. But when Dominic entered, his father turned slowly, almost as if he had been expecting him. "What is it, son?" the old man asked, his voice raspy, but there was no anger in it. No force. Just tiredness. Dominic felt a lump in his throat. This was the man who had ruled with an iron fist, the one who had built an empire that stretched across the country. And yet, here he was, vulnerable and alone. "I've been thinking, Father," Dominic began, his voice surprisingly steady. "I've been thinking about everything. About what you built and what I've inherited. And I realize now that I've been chasing the wrong things." The old man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't interrupt. "What do you mean?" he asked slowly. "I mean, I've spent my whole life building this empire. All of it has been about control, about power. But I've never really cared about anything, about anyone, other than that. Dominic paused, the weight of his own words sinking in. And I think I've lost sight of what really matters. His father was silent for a moment. Then, finally, he spoke. I know what you mean, son, he said, his voice softer than usual. I've spent my life doing the same thing, building something that would last, something that would keep me safe. But in the end, it was all for nothing. Look at me now. Dominic didn't know what to say. He had never heard his father speak this way before. He had always known his father to be strong, unyielding, a man who could take down anyone who crossed him. But now, there was a weariness in his voice, a regret that Dominic hadn't known was there. What should I do, father? Dominic asked, his voice thick with emotion. I've been living in the same way for so long. I don't know how to change. His father looked at him then, and for the first time, there was no judgment in his eyes. Only understanding. Change comes slowly, son, he said quietly. But it starts with one small step. You've got to stop trying to control everything. Stop trying to be the man I was. Find something, someone, that makes you feel alive again. Let go of the past and build something different. It's not too late. Dominic stood there for a long moment, taking in his father's words. He had always admired his father, but now, in this moment, he realized how much he had been blind to. The man who had once been a giant in his eyes was now just a man, with the same fears and regrets as anyone else. And that realization changed everything for Dominic. Later that day, Dominic sought out Clara. He didn't know exactly what he wanted to say, but he knew that he needed to start somewhere. When he found her, she was in the garden, tending to the flowers. She didn't hear him approach, but when she turned and saw him standing there, she didn't flinch or step back. She simply waited, patient as always. Clara, Dominic said, his voice steady but quiet. I want to thank you for everything you've done for my father, for showing me what real strength is. Clara's expression softened, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. Her actions had spoken louder than words ever could. Dominic continued, his voice breaking slightly. I know I've been lost, but I'm trying to change. I don't know where it will lead, but I want to try. Not just for my father, but for myself. Clara nodded, as if she had already known this was coming. That's all anyone can do, she said simply. Try, and then see where it takes you. Dominic stood there for a moment, taking in her words. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right path. He didn't have all the answers, but he was ready to start asking the right questions. And with that, for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. In the days that followed Dominic's conversation with Clara, a shift began to occur not just in him, but in the entire atmosphere of the Romano mansion. The cold, tense environment that had once dominated the sprawling estate seemed to soften. Dominic, for the first time in years, allowed himself to experience a sense of vulnerability. He spent more time with his father, having genuine conversations that weren't centered on business or power. For the first time in his life, he was seeing his father not as a ruthless mafia boss, but as a human being who had long been lost in the chaos of his own world. Dominic began to understand his father's loneliness. It had been buried beneath years of tough decisions and a hardened exterior, but as he spent more time with the old man, the cracks in that armor started to show. His father spoke more openly now, no longer holding back his thoughts. They talked about things they had never shared before: regrets, lost opportunities, moments of kindness, and the toll that their choices had taken. The distance between them that had once seemed insurmountable began to shrink. Dominic realized that he had never truly known his father. He had been so caught up in building his own empire that he had failed to see the price it had cost his family. Meanwhile, Clara continued her quiet, unwavering support. She was still there every day, taking care of his father with the same gentle care that had first caught Dominic's attention. She was never demanding, never expecting anything in return. It was the purity of her intentions that fascinated him. She didn't care about the wealth, the power, or the status. Her only concern was making sure that his father felt loved in his final days. Dominic found himself watching her more closely, not just out of curiosity, but with a growing sense of admiration. It was hard for him to understand how she could give so much of herself without expecting anything in return. But the more he saw her, the more he realized that she wasn't just a maid. She was a woman of deep strength and resilience. One evening, As Dominic watched Clara in the garden, tending to the flowers, he decided to speak to her again. He wanted to thank her, but there was something more he needed to say. As he approached her, Clara looked up and smiled, her expression warm and kind. She had always been kind to him, even when he hadn't deserved it. "Clara," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I want to thank you for everything you've done for my father, for the way you've cared for him, and for the way you've shown me what truly matters." Clara paused for a moment, her hands stilling as she looked at him. She seemed to sense the sincerity in his voice. "You don't have to thank me, Mr. Romano," she said quietly. "I'm just doing what I believe is right." Dominic nodded, his heart heavy with emotion. "But it's more than that. You've changed my life. And I think you've changed my father's too. You've shown us both what it means to care for someone without expecting anything in return. That's something I've never known before." Clara looked down at her hands, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, she smiled faintly. "I'm glad I could help," she said. "But I don't need anything from you, Dominic. I only wish for your father to find peace before it's too late." The simplicity of her words hit him harder than he had expected. He had spent his life chasing after things that were never truly fulfilling, always thinking that power and control were the answers. But Clara had shown him a different path. She had shown him that true strength came from compassion, from giving without expecting anything in return. Dominic felt a weight lift off his shoulders as he looked at Clara, realizing that he didn't need to carry the burden of his father's empire alone. He could still be a strong leader, but he didn't have to sacrifice everything that made him human to do so. "Clara," Dominic said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to say this, but I want you to know that I respect you, more than you'll ever know." Clara met his gaze, her eyes soft, but resolute. "I don't need respect, Dominic," she said. "I just need you to understand. The way you're living, the way you've been living, it's not the only way." Dominic stood there for a long moment, the weight of her words settling deep within him. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, he felt hopeful. He didn't need to be the man he had once been, the cold, calculating mafia boss who had built an empire of fear. He could be something different. He could be someone who led with kindness, who didn't just demand loyalty, but earned it. As he walked away from Clara, Dominic felt a sense of clarity he had never experienced before. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew this much. He wasn't alone anymore. He had found someone who truly cared for him, someone who had changed the way he saw the world. And in that moment, Dominic knew that it was time for him to change as well. The days following Dominic's conversation with Clara were filled with a strange, new calm. His mind was clearer now, and he found himself reevaluating everything in his life, from the way he ran his business to the relationships he had with those around him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much of his life had been consumed by his desire for control and power. But now, standing on the precipice of change, he wondered if there was still time for him to transform. His father's health continued to decline, but the transformation in his demeanor was undeniable. Clara's care had softened him in ways that no one had ever expected. For the first time, the old man was opening up about his past, his regrets, and the decisions he had made. Dominic found himself listening more than he ever had before, and in those conversations, he learned more about his father's vulnerabilities than he had ever cared to understand. But there was something else, something even more profound, that had begun to shift in Dominic's world. He started to realize that Clara's quiet strength had not only transformed his father, but had also made him see the world through a different lens. The empire he had built, the empire that had consumed so much of his life, seemed less important now. What really mattered, he understood, were the people around him and the connections he had with them. Dominic began to spend more time with Clara, not as his employee, but as a person. He wanted to understand her better. The more they talked, the more he admired her resilience. Despite the losses she had endured, despite the hardships she had faced, she had managed to remain kind and compassionate. She had shown him that there was a way to live with grace, even in the face of unimaginable pain. One afternoon, Dominic found himself once again walking through the mansion's sprawling gardens. He had come to check on his father, but his thoughts were preoccupied with Clara. He had come to a realization. He needed to make things right. He needed to act on what he had learned from her, from his father, and from his own reflections. It was time to step up, not just for himself, but for the people he cared about. He approached Clara in the garden, her hands busy with tending to the flowers. She looked up at him and offered a small, but warm smile. Dominic could feel the tension leave his shoulders. In her presence, he felt at ease, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Clara," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I've been thinking about everything you've done, not just for my father, but for me as well." Clara's brow furrowed slightly, and she set her gardening tools aside, giving him her full attention. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice gentle. "I mean," Dominic continued, "you've changed my life. You've opened my eyes to something I never saw before. I've spent so long living in a world of power and control, but I've missed the point. I've missed the people who really matter." Clara didn't say anything right away. Instead, she simply looked at him, her expression soft but unreadable. "I've spent my whole life trying to be something I thought I needed to be," Dominic went on, his voice now quieter. "But now I see that I don't need all of that. I don't need the empire. I don't need the fear or the control. What I need is to make things right, to rebuild my relationships, to be a better man." Clara took a slow breath, her gaze not leaving his. "It's not an easy path," she said softly, "and it won't happen overnight. But I believe you can change, Dominic, if you really want to." Dominic nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I want to," he said firmly. "I want to do better. For my father. For you. For myself." Clara's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, she seemed to study him closely, as if assessing whether he truly understood the weight of his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but filled with sincerity. "Then start by being kind to those around you," she said. "Start by being there for your father, for the people who have supported you, and for yourself." Dominic felt a sense of peace wash over him as he listened to her. For so long, he had been focused on building an empire, on being a leader feared by all. But now, in this moment, he realized that true leadership came from understanding, from compassion, and from being present with those who mattered most. "I'll try," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I'll start by doing right by you, Clara. And by my father." Clara gave him a small, approving nod. "That's all anyone can do," she said quietly. Dominic stood there for a moment, looking at Clara. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and he didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right path. And that feeling, that sense of hope and possibility, was something he hadn't felt in a long time. As he walked away, he knew that everything had changed. The world he had once known, the world of power and fear, no longer held the same allure. The path he was about to walk would be different, but it was the only path that truly mattered. And as he stepped into that future, he knew that Clara's quiet strength would always be with him, guiding him toward a better life. After Dominic's vow to change and make things right, the atmosphere in the Romano mansion shifted even further. It was subtle at first, small gestures, conversations that were more open than before, but to Dominic, it felt like the weight of 1,000 decisions had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He spent more time with his father, helping him with tasks that once seemed insignificant, but now held more meaning. The old man, though still frail, seemed to grow lighter with each passing day. Clara's role in this transformation had been undeniable. She had given his father the emotional care that no one else had been able to offer, and now it was time for Dominic to carry that torch. As the days passed, Dominic found himself reflecting on Clara's words more and more. She had told him that it wasn't just about making big, sweeping changes, but about making small, intentional decisions every day. He had spent his life making decisions based on power, influence, and control, but now he understood that true change came from making choices grounded in empathy and kindness. One evening, as Dominic sat in his father's study, the weight of his thoughts began to settle in. He was no longer just a mafia boss. He was a son, a man who had begun to learn how to open his heart. His mind kept circling back to Clara. She had been more than just the person who cared for his father. She had shown him a way of life that he never imagined possible, a life led by care and compassion. Yet, despite all this, Dominic still hadn't found a way to fully express his gratitude. He had tried to change, but words seemed inadequate for what he felt. He wanted to do something for her, something that would truly show how much he valued her. The following morning, Dominic found Clara once again in the garden, tending to the flowers she had lovingly cared for ever since he could. Remember, she was kneeling by the roses, her fingers gently brushing the petals. Her presence was calm, almost serene, and it struck Dominic once more how much she had quietly influenced his life. He watched her for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. Then, finally, he made up his mind. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying across the distance. She looked up, her expression as calm as ever. "Yes, Mr. Romano," she asked, standing slowly. "I wanted to thank you," he began, stepping closer, his words coming from deep within. "For everything you've done, for my father, and for me." Clara's eyes softened, but she didn't respond immediately. "I don't think I can fully express how much I appreciate what you've given us," Dominic continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You've changed my life. And I know you've changed my father's too. He's not the same man he was before." Clara paused for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "I'm glad he's doing better," she said simply. "I never did it for gratitude, Dominic. I just did what I thought was right." Dominic nodded, feeling a sense of admiration for her. It was the quiet simplicity of her words that moved him so deeply. She had never expected anything in return, never asked for recognition, and yet here she was, changing their lives in ways that no one could have imagined. "I know you didn't do it for gratitude," Dominic said, his voice quieter now. "But I want you to know that I'm grateful, Clara, more than I've ever been for anything in my life." She met his gaze, her expression softening. For a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared acknowledgement of the unspoken bond that had formed between them. "I never thought of myself as anyone special," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just did what I could." Dominic took a step closer to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "You are special, Clara. You've made me see what really matters. You've given me the chance to change." Clara's gaze softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to show a small, genuine smile. "You're the one who made the decision to change, Dominic," she said. "I just helped you see it." Dominic felt a rush of warmth in his chest. He had come to understand. Over the past few weeks, that change didn't come from the outside. It came from within. And Clara had been the spark that lit the fire inside him. He realized that he wanted to do more than just change for the sake of it. He wanted to create a life that was better, not just for him, but for everyone around him. "Clara," Dominic said, his voice steady, "I don't know what the future holds, but I want you to be a part of it. I want you to be a part of this family. You've already done so much for us, and I think it's time we do something for you." Clara's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Dominic took a deep breath, his decision final. "I want you to be more than just a maid in this house. I want you to have the same opportunities as anyone else. You deserve that." Clara shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "Mr. Romano, I don't need anything. I've already found what I need here." But Dominic shook his head. "No, Clara. You've given so much of yourself, and now it's time for me to give something back." He paused for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "From now on, I want you to be part of the Romano family, not just as an employee, but as someone who is valued. I want to help you, just like you've helped us." Clara's eyes softened as she looked at him. "Thank you, Dominic," she said quietly. "That means more to me than you'll ever know." And for the first time in his life, Dominic truly understood what it meant to be part of a family, what it meant to care, to give, and to make a difference. The days that followed Dominic's decision to welcome Clara into the Romano family were filled with a quiet anticipation. The change in his life was not instant, but the seed had been planted. Dominic was determined to show Clara how much she meant to him and his family, and in doing so, he also realized that he was showing himself what it meant to truly live with purpose. His father's health continued to deteriorate, but the emotional healing he had begun was still growing stronger. Dominic spent more time by his side, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to. It was in those moments with his father that Dominic truly started to understand the significance of family, how it wasn't about control or power, but about connection and support. He often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, a man once driven by fear, now driven by compassion. As for Clara, her role in their lives had shifted. No longer just a maid, she was becoming more integrated into their world. Her quiet strength had made her a central figure, not only in caring for his father, but also in shaping the path Dominic was now walking. She had never sought recognition, but her actions spoke volumes. Every day, she continued to care for his father, offering him a level of comfort that had been missing for so long. And Dominic began to notice something he hadn't seen before: the profound impact she had on those around her. The entire mansion felt different, lighter even. There was an underlying warmth in the house now, a warmth that had been absent during the years of power struggles and unspoken tension. It was the result of Clara's kindness, and it had rippled through the Romano family. But there was still one person Dominic hadn't fully addressed. His mother's absence had always been a sore subject, a wound that had never fully healed. The memories of her were fading, but the pain of her death was still fresh in Dominic's mind. He realized that, in trying to fix everything with his father, he had neglected the emotional distance that still lingered with his mother's passing. One evening, as Dominic sat with his father in the study, he felt a sudden urge to visit her grave. He hadn't been there in years. His father, sensing his son's thoughts, spoke up, his voice surprisingly gentle. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" his father said, looking out the window toward the distant horizon. "Since you've visited her." Dominic nodded, the weight of his father's words sinking in. "I've been so focused on trying to fix what I've done wrong," he said quietly, "that I never really stopped to grieve. I thought I had to fix everything, to prove I could be better." His father looked at him, his expression unreadable. "There's no need to prove anything, son," he said softly. "Some things can't be fixed, but you can still make things right. For her, and for yourself." Dominic's chest tightened as the realization hit him. He had been so determined to fix the past that he had forgotten to live in the present. He needed to forgive himself, just as he had learned to forgive his father. And for the first time, he understood that healing didn't always mean fixing things. It meant accepting them. The next morning, Dominic stood in front of his mother's grave. The place was peaceful, serene, a stark contrast to the chaos he had created in his life. The sun was rising, casting a soft golden light over the tombstone. Dominic knelt down, his hands shaking as he touched the cold stone. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "I've been trying so hard to fix everything, but I've never really taken the time to just be with you. I'm sorry I didn't do better by you." He sat there for a long while, the silence wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel everything: the grief, the regret, and the understanding that healing came from letting go of the need to be perfect. When Dominic returned to the mansion, something had changed in him. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He was no longer the man driven by fear of his past or the need to control his future. He was a man learning how to live with kindness, to be present for the people around him. He found Clara in the garden, as he often did, tending to the flowers with the same quiet grace. He approached her slowly, unsure of how to express the depth of what he felt. But when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Clara," he said, "I need to thank you again. For everything you've done, for my father, for me." Clara looked up, her hands stilling for a moment. She gave him a soft smile, one that seemed to reach her eyes in a way that made Dominic's heart skip a beat. "You've already thanked me, Mr. Romano," she said softly. "But it's not about gratitude. It's about making things right, just like you're doing now." Dominic stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm trying," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I want you to know that everything you've given us hasn't gone unnoticed. You've made me see what truly matters, Clara, and I'm not going to take that for granted." Clara's eyes softened, her smile growing warmer. "You don't need to say anything more," she replied quietly. "I've seen the change in you, Dominic. That's enough." And in that moment, Dominic realized that he had already started to make things right. It wasn't about grand gestures or trying to fix everything all at once. It was about the small, everyday choices to be better, to be kind, and to learn how to love, not just others, but himself as well. With Clara by his side, and with his father slowly finding peace, Dominic knew that the road ahead would be one filled with challenges, but also with hope. And for the first time, he felt ready to face it all. As the weeks passed, the transformation within the Romano mansion became undeniable. Dominic had embraced the changes within himself, but it wasn't just him who had been affected. His father, once a symbol of ruthless authority, now sat more often in the garden, watching the world outside with a sense of quiet contemplation. He had grown used to the idea of slowing down, a luxury that his life of power had never afforded him. Clara, though still tending to her duties, had begun to feel a shift in how she was viewed within the household. Dominic, who had once seen her as merely an employee, now regarded her as an equal, and his respect for her was apparent to everyone. Her role in his father's life had already earned her a place in their family's dynamic. But now, even those who had once ignored her, or perhaps even looked down on her, began to notice the impact she had made. It wasn't just Dominic who had changed. The entire atmosphere of the mansion had softened, becoming a place where empathy and understanding took precedence over the cold calculation that had once defined it. For the first time in years, there was laughter, warmth, and even moments of peace. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't without its challenges, but it was real. Dominic spent more time with Clara, not just in the formal setting of family meetings or business discussions, but in moments of quiet reflection. They would talk about anything and everything, sometimes about his father, other times about life in general, and often about things they never would have discussed before. Their connection deepened, and Dominic began to see in her the kind of strength he had always admired but never truly understood. Clara had never tried to change him. She had never asked for anything in return for her kindness. And yet, she had done something more profound than anyone else ever could. She had taught him what it meant to truly be alive, to not simply exist, but to live with purpose. As the seasons changed, the relationship between Dominic and Clara grew stronger, and Dominic found himself questioning even more about the life he had lived. He had built an empire, yes, but at what cost? His thoughts were interrupted one morning when his father called for him. He had been getting weaker, and though his mind remained sharp, his body could no longer keep up. The two men sat together in his father's study, the air thick with unspoken words. His father's voice was raspy, but it carried a weight of years lived in silence and regret. "I see the change in you, Dominic," he said, his gaze distant. "And I'm glad. For so long, I've lived with regrets. I thought I could control everything, force it into my image. But in the end, it wasn't worth it." Dominic nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I've realized that now, Father," he replied quietly. "But it's not just about what we've done. It's about what we do moving forward." His father smiled weakly. "That's right. You've learned something I never could. You're finding your way in a world I can't keep up with anymore." Dominic felt a bittersweet sadness settle over him. He had spent so much of his life trying to prove himself, trying to become someone his father would be proud of. But now, he realized that his father's approval wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was what he was doing for himself and the people around him. Later that day, Dominic walked out into the garden to find Clara. She was there, as always, tending to the plants with quiet care. He stood there for a long time, just watching her. She had become such a central part of his life, and yet he still hadn't fully expressed the gratitude he felt. Finally, he stepped forward. "Clara," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been thinking about everything, and I realize now that there are no words for what you've done for us. For me." Clara paused and looked up at him, her face calm but attentive. "You don't have to say anything, Dominic," she replied softly. "I've done what I felt was right, what I knew had to be done." He shook his head, his heart full. "No, you've done more than that. You've changed everything, and I want you to know that it hasn't gone unnoticed. Not by me, and not by my father." Clara's expression softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to step away from her usual reserve. "I never wanted anything in return," she said quietly. "But I appreciate your words. They mean more than you know." Dominic stepped closer, his voice thick with sincerity. "You've made us all better, Clara, and I'm going to do everything I can to show you that I see that I understand it. I don't want to lose the chance to thank you, to show you how much you've done for me, for my father." Clara's eyes shone with unshed tears, but she quickly blinked them away. She had never expected this from Dominic, but it warmed her heart to know that he truly understood. "I'm just doing my part," she said softly, a small, genuine smile forming on her lips. "We all have our roles to play." Dominic smiled, a feeling of peace settling in his chest. For so long, he had lived his life in pursuit of power, of building something that could never be taken from him. But in the end, it was the simple, quiet acts of kindness, like Clara's, that had truly built something worthwhile, something lasting. "I want you to be a part of this family, Clara," Dominic said firmly. "You've earned a place here, not as an employee, but as a member of our family." Clara's eyes widened, surprise evident in her gaze. "You've already given me more than I could have ever asked for, Dominic," she replied quietly. "But thank you. That means more than you know." As Dominic walked away from the garden, he realized that this was just the beginning. He wasn't finished changing. He would never be finished, but he had taken the first step toward becoming the man he had always needed to be. And it was all because of Clara, who had shown him that the path to true power wasn't through control, but through kindness and understanding. As the days turned into weeks, Dominic felt a quiet shift within himself that he could no longer ignore. He had begun to understand the power of vulnerability, the power of human connection that had once seemed so foreign to him. His relationship with Clara had grown into something neither of them had expected. She had become a confidant, someone he could trust, someone who showed him the value of being present, of being truly seen. The mansion, once filled with cold authority and fear, was now a place where Dominic found peace. His father, though still struggling with his health, had become a different person. The harsh edge he once carried had softened, replaced by a sense of calm that came from knowing he was no longer alone. It was Clara's constant care that had brought that change, but it was Dominic's own growth that had allowed him to see it. As he sat with his father one evening, watching the sunset through the large windows of the study, Dominic could sense that time was running out. His father's health was failing, and every day felt like a gift that was slipping away too quickly. The two men sat in silence, both knowing the inevitable was coming. It wasn't just his father's illness that weighed on Dominic. It was the realization that their time together was limited, and they hadn't had the chance to fix everything that had been broken between them. "Son," his father said, his voice a little raspy from disuse, "I'm proud of you. You've come a long way." Dominic's heart tightened. He had spent so many years seeking his father's approval, but now, in these quiet moments, he understood that it wasn't his father's approval he needed, it was his own. "I've spent so many years chasing something," Dominic replied softly. "I didn't realize what I was missing until it was too late. But I'm here now, and I'm trying. For both of us." His father smiled faintly, a hint of pride in his eyes. "I see that, Dominic. And that's all I could ever hope for." The weight of those words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time, Dominic felt at peace with himself. Later that night, Dominic found Clara in the kitchen, preparing a late meal. She looked up as he entered, her face softening when she saw him. "How is he?" she asked quietly, not needing to be told the full story. Dominic took a deep breath. "He's holding on," he said, his voice low. "But I think we both know the time is coming. It's hard to accept, but I'm grateful for the time we've had." Clara nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You've done what you could, Dominic. And he knows that. He's proud of you." Dominic met her gaze, a warmth spreading in his chest. "I never thought I'd hear those words from him, but I think I've earned them, in my own way." Clara stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "You've earned more than that. You've earned the chance to live a different life, to make things right." Dominic reached out, taking her hand in his, the simple act feeling more profound than anything he had ever done before. "I'm not the same man I was," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "And I have you to thank for that." Clara looked at him, her expression calm, almost knowing. "You did the work, Dominic. I just showed you the way." As the days passed, Dominic became more involved with his father's care, helping Clara where he could. He had realized that the most important thing he could do was simply be there, to spend these last moments with his father in a way that was meaningful for both of them. Clara remained by their side, offering her unwavering support, and Dominic couldn't help but notice how much he had come to rely on her, not just for her care of his father, but for her wisdom, her strength, and her ability to help him see the world in a way that no one else had. One morning, as he sat by his father's side, holding his hand, Dominic felt a sudden sense of clarity. His father had lived a life of power, of dominance, but in the end, it was the relationships he had with those he loved, or those who had cared for him, that mattered most. Dominic knew that the same would be true for him. His power, his wealth, all of it would eventually fade, but the people in his life, the connections he had made, were what would remain. As his father's health continued to decline, Dominic spent more time reflecting on what he had learned. He knew there would be no easy answers, no quick fixes, but he had come to understand that it was the everyday moments that truly mattered. The simple act of sitting by someone's side, the quiet gestures of kindness. Those were the things that made a life meaningful. And Dominic was ready to live a life that was rich in those moments. Clara had shown him that a life driven by love and compassion was more powerful than any empire he could ever build. As he looked at his father, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons he had learned, both from him and from Clara. It wasn't too late to change, to make things right, and Dominic knew that he was finally ready to do just that. The days passed slowly but meaningfully, and with each passing moment, Dominic grew more attuned to the quiet peace that had settled over the Romano mansion. His father, once an indomitable force in the criminal world, was now more vulnerable, more human. His body, ravaged by time and illness, seemed to make him more introspective, and in the stillness of the mansion, Dominic began to have conversations with his father that had never been possible before. He no longer sought approval from the old man, but instead spent time sharing thoughts and feelings that had long been buried under the weight of family expectations. It was an unexpected but precious gift. As for Clara, her role in their lives had evolved. She had not only cared for his father, but had become a quiet anchor in Dominic's own transformation. With every act of kindness, with every moment of patience, Clara had taught him the true value of empathy and connection. She had shown him that love was not about grand gestures, but about small, meaningful actions every day. Dominic had learned that the most important things in life were not the empires one built, but the relationships they nurtured. One afternoon, Dominic found himself once again in the garden with Clara, watching as she carefully tended to the flowers. The warm sun bathed them both in golden light, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stood still. There was no pressure, no expectations, just the simple presence of two people who had found something genuine in each other. Clara, Dominic began, his voice low but steady. I want to thank you, not just for everything you've done for my father, but for what you've done for me. Clara paused in her work and looked at him, her expression calm but curious. You've changed my life, Dominic continued. I've spent so long chasing power, trying to control everything around me. But I see now that the things that really matter have always been right in front of me. And you showed me that. Clara smiled softly, her eyes reflecting a warmth that had always been there, hidden beneath her quiet exterior. I didn't do anything extraordinary, Dominic. I just did what felt right. We all have our roles to play. Dominic felt a deep surge of gratitude as he stepped closer to her. You did more than that, he said earnestly. You helped me see the world in a way I never could before. And I want to make sure you know how much that means to me. I've spent too much of my life focusing on the wrong things, but now I understand. I want to live better, not just for myself, but for those I care about. Clara's gaze softened, and she nodded slowly. You're already on the right path, Dominic, she said, her voice gentle but firm. The fact that you're even aware of the need for change means you've already taken the first step. Dominic's chest tightened with emotion, and he reached out, taking her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt like the most significant thing he had ever done. I want you to know, he said quietly, that I value you, not just for what you've done for us, but for the person you are. Clara's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but her smile deepened, and she gave his hand a gentle squeeze. You don't have to say anything more, Dominic, she replied, her voice warm. I understand. You've already shown me everything I need to know. As the days turned into weeks, Dominic continued to grow, both in his personal relationships and his sense of purpose. He no longer spent his days managing the family business with the same level of obsession that had once defined his life. Instead, he focused on nurturing the bonds with the people who mattered most, his father, Clara, and the few who had remained by his side. His father's condition worsened, but there was no bitterness between them. In his final days, the old man and his son shared moments of peace and understanding that had never been possible before. Dominic had learned to let go of the past and to accept the things he could not change. He had come to realize that love, in all its forms, was the greatest legacy anyone could leave behind. One evening, as his father lay in bed, breathing shallowly but peacefully, Dominic sat by his side, holding his hand. It was a quiet moment, one that held the weight of a lifetime. The years of tension, the years of estrangement, had all faded away in the face of this simple act of presence. I'm proud of you, Dominic, his father whispered, his voice weak but full of sincerity. You found something I never could. Dominic's heart clenched as he looked at the old man. I've found what really matters, he replied quietly. And I'm grateful for everything you taught me, even when I didn't understand it. His father's eyes closed, and for a moment, Dominic thought he might be slipping away. But then, the old man opened his eyes again, a faint smile on his lips. You've done well, he said softly. You've done better than I ever could. With those final words, Dominic's father passed away, leaving behind a legacy of power, but also the understanding that true strength came from love and connection, not fear and control. After his father's passing, Dominic continued to honor the lessons he had learned, both from his father and from Clara. The mansion, once a place of cold ambition, became a home. And in that home, Clara stood beside Dominic, not just as his caretaker or employee, but as a true partner, someone who had taught him the greatest lesson of all, that love, kindness, and compassion were the only things worth building a life around. As the weeks turned into months after his father's passing, Dominic Romano's life took on a new rhythm, one that was no longer dictated by power or fear. The mansion, once a symbol of ruthless ambition, now echoed with a sense of peace and understanding. Dominic had made peace with his past, and while the memories of his father's empire still lingered, they no longer controlled his every decision. He no longer had to prove himself to anyone, least of all his father. The lessons he had learned from Clara, the lessons of compassion, humility, and love, were now guiding his every step. He had become someone who was more than just a mafia boss. He was a man who had learned to live with purpose, to cherish the people in his life, and to build meaningful relationships. Clara, ever steady and unwavering, stood by him every step of the way. Their bond, once built on a quiet mutual respect, had grown into something more. They had both changed, both grown, and it had happened slowly, over time, but now, it was undeniable. They had become partners in every sense of the word. For the first time, Dominic understood what it meant to love and be loved, not for power or status, but for who they truly were. Clara had taught him that the greatest strength lay in vulnerability, in the ability to care for others without expectation, and in the courage to open up, even when it meant facing his own flaws. One evening, as Dominic sat in the study, reflecting on everything that had transpired, Clara entered quietly, carrying a tray of tea. She set it down in front of him and sat across from him, offering a small smile. The room was quiet, the evening light filtering through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. Dominic looked at her, a deep sense of gratitude flooding through him. I never thought I'd be here, Clara, he said, his voice low. I never thought I'd have a life like this, a life that's about more than just power and control. Clara smiled softly, her eyes warm. You're here now, Dominic, and that's what matters. He reached for her hand across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. You've changed everything for me. I know I'll never be the same man I was before, and I'm thankful for that. Clara didn't speak immediately, but her expression was one of understanding, one that had always been there, silent but powerful. After a moment, she said quietly, We've both changed. We've both learned. Dominic nodded. I've learned that love isn't about ownership or control. It's about freedom. Freedom to be vulnerable, to be human, to let go of the things that keep us locked away from one another. Clara's eyes sparkled with something like quiet pride. And it's about choosing to care, even when it's difficult, even when it's messy. Dominic smiled, feeling the weight of his past lifting more with every word. I've never truly cared for anyone like I care for you. And I know it's not perfect, but it's real. Clara squeezed his hand gently. It's real, she agreed. And that's enough. Their time together had been nothing short of transformative. And while Dominic's father's death had marked the end of an era, it also marked the beginning of something new, something that had been quietly brewing within him, waiting to emerge. He was no longer the man who sought to control, to dominate, to lead through fear. He had become a man who led with empathy, who understood that the true measure of power lay in his ability to connect with others. The Romano name would still carry weight in certain circles, but now, it meant something different. It meant redemption, growth, and the courage to face the past. As Dominic and Clara stood side by side, looking out at the garden they had both tended to over the past few months, He realized that the greatest legacy he could leave behind was not an empire of wealth or influence, but an empire built on love, kindness, and the lessons learned from those who had shown him the way. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but Dominic felt ready. He was no longer the man he had once been, and with Clara by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next, together. "We've come a long way," Dominic said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Clara smiled, her gaze steady and confident. "We have," she agreed, "and we're just getting started." And with that, Dominic knew that the journey ahead, while uncertain, would be a journey worth taking. With Clara, he had found something deeper than power or control. He had found peace, and with it, the chance to build something lasting and real.